Can you also see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So thanks for joining today. Today we're going to discuss visual design basics. So first I want to start by talking a little bit about what visual design actually is. And so typically when most people hear from visual design, if they have had exposure to something like the screenshot you're seeing here, which is a bunch of design mocks on a site called Dribble, they think about colors and things kind of looking quote unquote beautiful, or something attached to the visual representation of an idea. And that's partly correct. But one thing it is not solely is just aesthetics. Visual design is a lot more than that. And we'll go through the components of visual design today. And so my goal is that by the end of this hour that you'll all have a foundational understanding of the components that go into visual design, so that you can better visually communicate your ideas, but also just have an understanding of different considerations to take when you are figuring out different design decisions to make. So additionally, there's this myth that designers are these spirit animals of sorts that have these magical powers to make things look visually appealing. And that's not true either. What is true is that there are heuristics that have over time been refined, that our brains and our eyes gravitate towards, and the way that our brains process information, and designers understand these things and they lean into them, and so they're able to visually communicate their ideas a bit better than the rest of us. And so here is an example of what a design process can look like visually. These are all different representations of the same idea, and this designer wanted to communicate this seed sort of visual representation for a client, and wanted to come up with all of these different iterations to communicate the same exact idea. But I'm showing this just to give you all a glimpse into the process of designing. And it's largely rooted in iteration as quickly as possible, and to try to find the best representation of the idea for a particular persona or particular user group. And the only way to do that, well, the way to do that most effectively is to come up with as many iterations as possible and to test all of them out. And so this is an example of how a talented designer can lean into that part of the process. But just wanted to give you all a glimpse into a foundational understanding of what design is rooted in, and it's rooted in iteration around specific ideas. And so to give you another example, here is, these are all different iterations of a success landing page. And so you can see these are all different, very different, drastically different, in some cases, representations of how to communicate a success checkout page. So visual design is drawing someone's attention to what is most important, while also conveying an emotion. And the second piece is definitely secondary to the primary objective. However, different components of visual design do communicate different aspects of emotion. And so in some cases, this is really relevant, and we'll start talking about some of those when we get to discussing shapes and composition. Visual design also guides the user to know what to do next. And this is tangential to the very primary objective of drawing contrast and trying to grab the attention of the user, of the viewer as well. Next, visual design is iterative, which I showed a little bit earlier, and it's based on a set of rules, which I spoke about a little bit earlier. These heuristics that we'll get into in a second about understanding how to communicate different components of visual design. One thing to note, we do not recommend designing components from scratch, but these basics will help you use an existing system. So some of the existing systems that exist, namely, are like Bootstrap, Material UI, and some others. So for the rest of the time, we will go through these different components. So first starting with shape, next color, then typography, and then we'll get into different effects, as well as wrapping up with how to communicate visual design by understanding composition a bit better. Cool. So first, shape. So in the thread, could y'all chime in and really quickly let me know which of these shapes do you believe is friendlier? Triangle. Awesome, pretty unanimous for the circle, excuse me. And now, how about which of these shapes do you believe is more trustworthy? Okay, I see square, square. Square, different. Cool, we're seeing a majority for the square. Now, how about these two? And so there is a square with really firm right angles, and then the one on the left is a square with rounded edges. Cool, interesting. So, really quickly, rounded edges and rounded shapes, typically, if you go out and test them in user research, it's a design axiom, meaning it's regardless of how many times you go out and test this with different or different populations, people will lean towards a circle or rounded edges being more friendly, and conversely, lean towards sharper edges and right angles, communicating things that are a bit more stable. And I'll show you some representations of how these show up in brand identities and sites that exist right now. And so how this relates to UI is that all of these UI components revolve off of the same few shapes of boxes and lines and using negative space. We'll go through some of those in a second as well. But depending on the type of emotion that you want to elicit from the user, or the type of emotion that is your brand wants to communicate, you can use each of these different representations for your application, depending on how stable you want to communicate your brand or how friendly you want to. And so we see examples of this in the screenshots. And so the banking app on the left of Wells Fargo, you see a lot of straight lines and 90-degree angles and edge corners, trying to communicate stability and trustworthiness. And conversely, all the way on the right is Duolingo. You see they have leaned heavily into the rounded edges and circles to communicate a friendly type of aesthetic and a visual design. And so Duolingo, folks that aren't aware, is a site to learn how to learn languages, which is typically something that people don't find a lot of enjoyment in or historically have not. And so with Duolingo's new service, they wanted to lean into reframing how fun their application can be in learning how to learn a new language. And so this is a visual representation of that vision, of that brand identity that they wanted to create. And in the middle, we have Lyft, which is somewhere in the middle of each of these designs. And so they do have the rounded edges, but the radius is not as high as the radius that you see within Duolingo. And all that means is that the rounded edges are not as rounded. They're more straight, and you get to a 90-degree angle, a sharp 90-degree angle versus this rounded curvature that you see in Duolingo. And so similarly, Lyft wants to communicate trust and stability, and that you can trust Lyft to get you from A to B, but also wanted to lean into the experience that they wanted to create with their riders in their rides, and that it should be a friendly experience. And this was communicated throughout the Lyft experience very early on, where they had the pink mustaches and the drivers used to fist pump folks. But these are different representations of how to communicate similar ideas. So every app can be translated into these simple shapes: rectangles, lines, and circles. And so again, every app that you take a look at and think about this when you're going through some of these experiences, they can be translated into these three shapes of rectangles, lines, and circles. So when you see a design you like, try to reframe how you're using and experiencing the app and try to simplify it in the simplest forms of those three shapes. And if you can start to see those shapes on the screen, designers call those wireframes. And typically when they start with creating UI for different visual ideas, they'll create wireframes first, just to get an understanding of from a structural, architectural standpoint, how the design feels and where the design components need to go, etc. And so here's an example of Lyft. And on the left side, you have the very high fidelity finished version in production. And on the right, you have all of these different components, all these different shapes, just created as wireframes. And so there's a really amazing site that's free to use that you can use to create flowcharts, wireframes, and mind maps, but really a lot of value offered between creating flowcharts and wireframes, called Whimsical. And so if you are looking for resources when you do need to create wireframes for any reason, or just need to visually try communicating different ideas, Whimsical is a great source. So really quickly, I'll pause for folks to ask questions in the chat before I move on. Cool. So next is shape. Oops, excuse me. We just finished shape, my bad. Cool. So next is color. Similarly in the thread in Slack, let me know which of these options do you believe is louder? Cool. A lot for the one on the right, the solid. Awesome. Just about unanimous. And so you're all correct. Joseph Abrams did. He was a color theorist, and he literally wrote the book on color theory in the 60s or the 50s. And one of the things that he uncovered is this idea of loudness within colors. And so typically, when people see more surface area of one color, they would define it as being louder than seeing less surface area. And so you see that represented here on the left when there is this hollowed out circle. So you see more of a contrast between the white and the purple. And because of that, your eye does not believe that it would not describe it as being louder versus seeing more surface area of the same color. And so why that's important is because we can use this idea to create contrast, but also draw the attention of the user to guide them to different aspects of our product that we want them to focus on. And so here are some ways of how this relates to UI. And so visually we see different representations of a button, a few different buttons here, and these are material UI buttons. And so as you might expect, the button that draws your attention most because you believe it is louder is the third option. And so typically this is used for the primary action that you want an individual to take in your application. And then secondary to that will be the button that is outlined but not filled in. And then lastly, just this button without any sort of border or fill is typically communicating tertiary options and actions that you want your user to take in your product. Next, which one of these feels safer? Awesome. Yeah, definitely the blue. And so this is almost always true, except in different cultures. This can feel safe, but in most Western cultures, you're going to find people answer this question by choosing the blue color. Next, which of these feels safer? This one's a bit tougher. Cool. About 50-50 blue and green. And so you'll see actually both of these kind of used to communicate safety, but there's a little bit of a difference in that typically you'll see a lot of green hues used to communicate growth. As a lot of things that are green that we experience in the physical world are growing and kind of living. And similarly, a lot of blue apps, like since they already feel safe, will be used to communicate, will really like be used to overemphasize safety and familiarity as well. Now we'll incorporate color and shape a little bit. Which of these feels safer? Cool. Yeah. So there's definitely mixed answers here, but we're seeing more for the blue square. And the reason this is true, or you'll typically find when you survey folks on this question, more people will say the blue squares because uh, shape as a visual design component trumps color in most cases. And so there's a hierarchy of people leaning into the shapes that are being communicated, and then they'll process the color in that order to get a sense of how they feel about a particular design. Cool. So these are actually two colors from real brands that you may be familiar with, but which one of these feels more secure? Interesting. Yeah, this one really looks like Facebook, but it's not. But yes, this is Twitter on the right. Cool. So dark blue is, obviously these can both be used to lean into communicating safety and security. Um, the blue on the left is Visa, and the blue on the right is Twitter. And so there's a lot of research done into which hue of blue to choose, and Visa arrived at this darker hue to communicate security. Now, really quickly, think a little bit about this. Does this feel weird? And if so, why does this feel weird? Looking at these two designs. Cool. We have colors aren't what you typically see. Yes, red equals negative. Green means go. Yes. Awesome. So you're all hitting the nail on the head. So again, in most Western cultures, you're going to find that green is communicated as a signal to move forward and go and progress. Um, and similarly, check signs are also visual representations of that in graphic design. And then conversely, red being signals for stop, and then X's as well. And so you're going to want to, I'm just drawing this out so you can align different elements of visual design. So obviously the shapes are consistent, but the colors are leaning into these things are called mental models. So just things that are already kind of true in different cultures and different user groups that they already experience in a lot of other places. They're going to be looking to have those similar experiences in your application. And so if you all of a sudden want to use this design, it's going to be very confusing for your users because they don't connect moving forward with red and stopping with green anywhere else, and so they're not going to be using your application. So it's really important to, when you can, try to think about how shapes, colors, and visual like icons and other visual representations come up in other applications and in the physical world, so that you can lean into those mental models that already exist, and that's going to help people understand how to use your application better. And so here's an example of that, of how very quickly when we flip these colors around from these very iconic brands, how off they look to a certain degree, and that's largely because of a lot of research went into using these different colors. So like, I know specifically for Subway, wanting to lean into using green to communicate freshness. And I know the McDonald's focusing on using really poppy, contrasting colors that can be found in their food. So you see the kind of French fry yellow, and then the ketchup red. And then when you flip them, they don't quite work as well as they do. And part of that's because we've been conditioned to see these brands with the colors that they already have. But um, even if you can try to take yourself out of that that model, they still kind of leave some room for improvement. Similarly here, we can see the same exercise with Coca-Cola and Pepsi. So you're going to want to use color to draw attention to the most important thing on the screen. And we see a few representations here. We have Twitter on the left and Spotify on the right. And so within the Twitter UI, you can see that the most important action that they want you to take is to contribute to the Twitter ecosystem by composing a tweet. And so you see that button in the bottom right, that's really close to where most right-handed users would be able to access. So you can very quickly access the primary action they want you to take within the application. And similarly, we see that here on Spotify, and the primary action that Spotify wants you to take when you are on an artist profile is to just very quickly be able to play, and not just play songs. They went through a lot of user research. People want to be able to just play different songs from the artist. So you can very quickly just go to the artist that you want to listen to, click shuffle play, and then automatically you'll start going through a random selection of songs from your artist. Next, you'll want to only use color when it has meaning. And there's a difference between a product and brand color palettes. And these two support one another, and the meaning here that we're speaking to is that you may have different objectives when you are adding color to a logo versus choosing a color palette to use throughout your application. And so this is just calling out that there can be differences between a product and brand color palette. Here's an example of Adobe I/O. And next, you want to focus on bringing color into your product with photography and illustration. And a couple of companies that do this really well are Airbnb. They use photography, and then you see a lot of healthcare companies now are using a lot of illustrations to bring in color as well to their applications. But here's an example of Airbnb. Apologies for the resolution being off a bit, but you can see there's really only, there are 3 colors used on the screen. And so you have white, black, and red. And this screen, this composition feels very colorful. That's because Airbnb has leaned into using visual representation as photography for different places around the world, to not just use those inspiring images of places to visit, but also to incorporate unique color into their design system. One heuristic I suggest is making sure that you stick to one product color. And so we see another example of this here, again with Airbnb. There's really only one product color, which is this red. And you can do a lot with, if you want to use photography and illustration, by just choosing one product color and letting the photography and the illustrations do the rest. Here are more examples of Airbnb using photography throughout their experience. So also from using that one product color, you'll want to try to accompany it with a text color and grays. And so grays are very important to use within app experiences. They can communicate a lot of contrast. which can communicate different states between something being disabled or create uh, subtitles and H1 titles. You can create contrast there using grays. And so one thing to think about is you don't necessarily need to find a bunch of different uh, types of grays. What I would recommend is using black and then just changing the opacity. And by changing the opacity, visually it will look gray, but that's just because the white background will be popping through the gray. Excuse me, be popping through the black font, and it will visually look gray. And so you can create different thresholds of opacity, and it'll look gray within your experience. And you'll be able to move quickly and code faster, and you won't necessarily need to worry about finding a bunch of different grays. A resource to use to find different product colors is ava.design. And so this is a really amazing design system where you can go and quickly type in the hex code for the particular brand color that you have in mind. And what this product will do is kick out the associated semantic colors for this brand color that look well, that look good, but also are aligned with accessibility standards. And so you see here, you have the screen for communicating success, warning danger, and info, et cetera. Really quickly before we progress, I want to pause. Are there any questions? If so, you can drop them in the thread in Slack. We have a question. My favorite color is I like these dark matte blues, similar to like that Pepsi you saw, but like with like a kind of matte finish, if you could imagine that. Cool, keep on going. So next is effects. And one thing to keep in mind is to avoid adding effects unless you have a very good reason. The reason for this is effects can be very distracting, and although we want to draw attention to certain actions, effects can be overwhelming to the point of confusing and distracting users from the task that they have in mind that you want them to actually take into account and complete within your application. So some of these effects I'm speaking to include borders, gradients, and drop shadows. And so you really only need to use the other components that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So color, shape, spacing, and type in your designs, and sometimes borders. So here's an example of some of these effects at play. And on the left, we don't see any effects used. And on the right, we do see gray being used to create this card, and this effect actually ends up creating a border. And so we don't need to necessarily use any of the effects that I mentioned. You can still accomplish the same goal by trying to draw attention to specific actions that you want your user to take by using some other elements of visual design that we already spoke about, like shape and color, to really create contrast. And so you draw your users' attention to specifically what you want them to focus on. And this is much easier to code than creating drop shadows and gradients and borders. Cool, and here's another example of different strokes for different borders here. And thing to note here is just a higher stroke will create more contrast and draw more attention than just this outline, this border that has a lower stroke and uses gray. So if you are trying to use, you want to create contrast and draw attention to a specific component on your screen, I'd recommend using the stroke version and just making sure that you're using a different color, but also increasing the stroke width. Additionally, you can also use color. And so we spoke about color theory briefly a little bit ago and drawing attention. And you might expect which has correlating effects here with making sure that you draw the attention of the user, but also communicating different emotions. Next, two other effects, drop shadows and gradients. They're extremely difficult to do well, which is why you don't see them that often in widely used applications. And so here is an example of drop shadows being used. And so here's a card with just the simple outline and a gray border, which is creating some contrast. And on the left, the designer has chosen to get rid of the border, but instead create a drop shadow, which gives the design this pop feel and to draw attention. But this is very difficult to not only code, but also be consistent with throughout your experience. And so the issue is that there's a drop shadow here on this card, but it's also not consistent with, there's not a drop shadow on this button, which is, it's fine, and it looks okay in this representation, but you'll find yourself bumping into issues where it's difficult to figure out, and you need to manage consistency when you're creating drop shadows for different types of shapes that look similar. Next, here's another example speaking to why gradients are difficult to use. So you can achieve, just by using a simple color, this red, a consistent color of communicating a contrast, but also making sure you're grabbing attention of your user's eye, as you can by using a gradient. And this is much easier to create a component of than this is. So I'll pause again before we move on. Are there any questions with regards to effects? Cool. So next is typography. And there's the saying that good typography is invisible and typography is everywhere. And notice bad typography. Well, if you are noticing the typography, you're noticing it because it is bad and it does not work well with the design. And so when typography is well aligned with the design and it is managed well from a composition standpoint and the spacing is correct, it just works and you don't necessarily notice it. You just read whatever the content is and then you move on. So trying to get you all in the just learning how to critically look at different design components. When you start to look at different websites around the internet that you really like, look for, try to notice the typography and inspect the actual CSS and try to learn about what types of typefaces that these different applications are using. And that will give you a foundational understanding of what types of typefaces that you can use in your project. So what you want to think about is just why is typography effective when you are finding it out, when you are looking at different typefaces across different products that you use. So here's a really good classic example of the New York City subway system, and this typeface was used, I believe, whenever they built the original subway system, and this just works, and people don't necessarily critique this. They can very quickly, when they're in a rush, get to platforms, sprint through stations with hordes of other folks, and they can understand where they are and where they need to go and how to be directed so they can navigate the subway system. But the thing to note here is that this is effective just because it works for this use case, and it doesn't necessarily, there's contrast where there needs to be contrast around the different lines. So you see that down here. And also they're using spacing appropriately, which we'll get into in a second. And you see that here with scale and spacing with the exit sign and where you'll be exiting to. So we'll go through picking a typeface, combining typefaces, and some tips and tricks. So first, picking a typeface. The first question you want to ask does the typeface that you're thinking about have a variety of weights and styles? And you're going to want to make sure that the styles that it has include italics. So here are two examples. So we have Roboto on the left and Open Sans on the right. And we see there are plenty of different weights and styles for us to use in our application. And all these different weights and styles can allow us to communicate different ideas within our application, but also more importantly, just draw appropriate attention to the actions that we want our users to take, and also create contrast where we need to create contrast. Next, you'll want to think about, are you using a particular typeface for headings or body text? And so headings can be a bit more complex, and so you can use serif fonts here, obviously sans serifs, but a lot of the complex, unique typefaces you can reserve for headers. But when you're using body text, you're going to want to try to keep body text simple and easy to read. And it's important to use copy that's representative of real data when you're using applications and creating designs. A few things to note here are the line heights, and line height is the space between the what's called the X height, and the X height is the top of a lowercase letter, and the baseline, which is the very bottom of the line above it, and that's defined as the line height. And so within headers, headers should have shorter line heights because typically the font sizes are larger, and visually that looks a bit better and it's easier for us to read. And similarly, body text should have taller line heights. So the degree of the line height should be higher, just because the fonts are typically a little bit smaller, and so it's easy for our eyes to read when there's a bit more space in between these lines. Next, you'll want to think about, are the characters differentiated? And here are two examples. And so these letters are at the very top. These are more differentiated from each other, and so they will be easier to read at smaller sizes. And on the bottom, these are very similar. You see these shapes are very similar, and these letters are less differentiated from one another, and so this can be harder for users to read at smaller sizes. Next, you want to think about what personality do you want to convey, and a way to back into trying to understand what personality you want to convey. It's just by understanding really, really well is who your audience is. So here are two examples. So this serif font is Source Serif Pro, and this tends to communicate a level of seriousness. And it has harder edges, and this gives off a bit more of a professional and serious personality. You see a lot of serifs on resumes for this reason. And then this font, Nunito, this can appear unprofessional in most scenarios, but could be good for a kids application just because it does have this whimsical feel to it with these very rounded edges here. Next, we'll talk about combining typefaces. And so the most important thing if you that you want to think about when you are combining typefaces is to create contrast. So really the only reason that you would want to combine typefaces is if you want to create contrast, even more contrast. And this typically comes into play when we're thinking about long form applications, when we're reading text that has a large header that needs to grab our attention, like within a newspaper app or something along those lines. The second rule here is to only change one thing at a time when you're thinking about combining typefaces. And an example of that is represented here. These are the same exact fonts, different weights and different sizes. Excuse me, not different weights, just different sizes. And you can see there's a lot of contrast created here. We didn't need to combine the typeface, but here we're trying to use the same font to see if we can combine or we can create some contrast. And it's not working that well, but the size is doing a pretty good job. So here we change the weight. Now the text on the top has has more weight, and so we're creating a bit more contrast there. And then we lower the opacity, and so we're changing the color, which we spoke about a little bit earlier, to create even more contrast. We haven't necessarily changed the typeface just yet, but we're still creating some contrast here. And then here's another representation of decreasing the weights and just using color to create contrast, this is doing a pretty good job, even though they're the same exact size. And finally, here is an example of us using different typefaces to create contrast. And so I'm going through all of these examples just to show y'all that you can still create a lot of contrast and draw attention to specific aspects of your product that you want your user to pay attention to without combining typefaces. So you can use all those different tools that I showed you earlier about color, shape as well. But if you do want to create a lot of contrast, you can by using different typefaces, but also just understand there are other ways to do so as well. So starting point, you can choose one sans serif typeface, so like Open Sans, Roboto, or Lotto. These are all font families that are called workhorses. And so by that, I mean that they can be used for a lot of different jobs within your application. And so they have a lot of different weights, and they have italics, and so you can use them for a lot of different aspects of your application. And only use that typeface with a variety of weights and sizes to create typographic hierarchy. So here's an example of typographic hierarchy. And so we see here that we're reserving this bold weight for the heading, the H1, as well as this black color, although this is also going to be black. No, we're reserving this weight for the header. Similarly, we're creating some contrast here by decreasing this weight to something that's around a thin weight. This is definitely a bold-ish weight. And looks like the opacity is decreased here as well to like 66 or something. And lastly, we have the body text, which is most important for folks to be able to read through at ease. It is really balanced and has a normal or a font weight that's towards the middle on the spectrum, and then it's using the black font as well, or the black color as well. And really quickly, we'll go through some tips and tricks. So first, try to stick to one font family. I gave some examples a little bit earlier, like Open Sans, Roboto, Lotto. Google Fonts has some great font families that you can download for free that are really broadly used across the internet. Adobe has a similar system for you to use called Typekit as well. Number two, avoid using all caps where you can. Although this is going to be highly dependent on the typeface, but generally try using all caps when you're communicating and using type within your application. Don't change the letter spacing. And so here's an example of what this could look like when you change the letter spacing. The defaults are sound, and you don't necessarily need to change them to try to communicate different aspects of visual design. Additionally, try to lean into the left alignment and using left aligned text. This is most legible. This is how we've been trained to in Western civilizations to read through compositions. And so our eyes scan from top to bottom, from left to right. And so therefore your most important aspects that you want your user to read are going to be top left, and try to use left alignment because it's most legible. Although it doesn't make sense in all cases, but in most it does. And sometimes center alignment is good for headings. So line length should be a max of 80 characters. And the line length is the amount, it's the cap, the maximum amount of characters that are in a line on a particular screen. So an example of this, a great example, is when you go to medium.com, when you read a Medium article, their max line length is if it's not 80 characters, it's very close. And so it's going to be adjusted for mobile devices, but on web, it's somewhere around 80 characters. But you can use that as a reference point. In the interest of time, we're not going to go through the exercise, but are there any questions really quickly on typography? Cool. Then we'll get through composition really quickly here. So last bit is composition. And one aspect of managing composition is to find a source image and use it as inspiration. And so by this, I mean just using other applications that you use readily and trying to critically think through the composition of those sites. And so when you are, critically looking at the composition of other sites that you like and doing a bit of a design critique, here's some general composition principles to think about. The first is scale. And scale is visually represented here by this dot. And what this communicates to your user is that this holds more weight. Visually, that is true. There's more surface area here. Therefore, typically, your attention is going to be drawn to the item on the screen that has more scale. And we see that communicated here again in Spotify with not just this button here, but also the size of the H1 text here of the artist. They really want you to know whose profile you're on, and the very next action is specifically the action I want you to take, which is play that artist's music. Next is Google Flights. And the element here that leans into scale is or using scale to communicate visual hierarchy is this search bar where they quickly want you to draw your attention to the center of the screen as well as this map so you can start to search flights for you to book to go to. Next is spacing and alignment. And the example I want to show here is how we've used space. We've decreased the amount of space between these three nodes here. And what that communicates to the user is that these three are related in some way, or that they are clustered around some sort of idea, or there is some sort of relation between these versus the rest of these dots. And we can go to Spotify again to see this communicated in an actual app experience. And so these designers have used spacing here to chunk the top portion of the screen as well as the personalization portion of the screen, so that you know that all of these, you go to the header here, and you have an understanding that all of these covers relate to albums that you have recently listened to. And similarly, these are all related to personalized playlists that have been created for you. And so here, again, are some more clear overlay examples of how Google Flights has used spacing to chunk these different aspects of the screen together. So we have these different components over here to allow you to navigate around different aspects of Google Flights. The search functionality is all closely related here. And similarly, if you do want to use the map to search or actually book, all those elements are closely chunked together spatially down here. I'll hold off on questions just because we are over time. But I do want to really quickly go through a summary of all these ideas, and then if folks still want to ask questions, I'll wait a little bit and answer them. So the first principle that you want to think about is to ask yourself what's most important in your on the screen that you are designing and coding, and to try to draw the user's attention to that most important action that you want them to take. Next, the way to do that is to create contrast, and we walk through some components that will allow you to do this. Next is to try to change one thing at a time to create contrast and try to get a sense of what works best for your users, and also draws attention in the most appropriate way for your the folks that you're building for. Next, be thoughtful in all the design decisions that you're making. So again, we walk through different components that you now have in your arsenal to create contrast and draw attention to different aspects of your product. What's important here is to try to make every single design decision about using different shapes, colors, spacing in different ways, typography in different ways with intention. And that will allow you to defend those decisions, or also just in a more educated way communicate why you chose to make a specific decision to other folks that you end up working with. So other designers, product managers, other developers, data scientists, users, etc. Lastly, going back to one of the very first slides about iteration, keep iterating as much as possible. The only way to find the most aligned experience is to try to use as many different iterations of that experience to see which has the highest conversions and which allows your users to have the most enjoyable experience, but while also going through the actions that you want them to take. Cool. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Y'all can drop them in the chat, and I'll answer them here. Great question, Janessa. Animations is a very deep topic in terms of transitions. I would stay to, I would keep with straightforward slide transitions. Those have those are going to be represented in other product experiences and in physical space more. And so people are going to understand that they're moving forward when they're using those animations a bit more. Sometimes the zoom in and zoom out transition animation can work as well. You see this a lot in Pinterest. Prezi, which is a slide software, use these types of animations to communicate moving forward or moving backwards. But if you can just chronologically move things from left to right, excuse me, from right to left, that will communicate moving forward. So I would lean into that transition. How do you balance the roles of UX and developer when it comes to design? Tips for working together effectively. The most effective experiences I've had myself and that I've seen have come from designers and developers working almost side by side or very closely. And so what ends up happening here is really quickly, these two disciplines typically are speaking about the same aspects of a particular design experience, but they just use different terminology. And so I've learned myself from primary experience, but also from other folks, of just having it's not pair programming essentially, but like having developers work with designers as they are going through wireframes. Designers can really quickly ask developers any questions that they may have, or typically after like a wireframe is completed, or there's low fidelity mocks or high fidelity mocks that are created, having the developer present in a critique and able to ask questions will allow the relationship to be much better and the asset handoff able to be much smoother. And so as often as you can, try to work together instead of siloed, so that feedback loop can happen much faster and is much tighter. That's going to decrease the amount of unnecessary back and forth that's going to inevitably happen if you don't do this. And so yeah, my advice would definitely be to try to close the feedback loop and work as closely together as you can.
And then adding to that, Dan, even get involved in their Figma file and make some comments on any of the components or reviews they're designing.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you all. And I'm sure you'll get the recording. We can send this out shortly later tonight.